Our call to worship this morning, like many other parts of this morning's service, is taken from the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This is from, I don't know exactly whether it was a sermon or another sermon or a lecture. It was a theme that he returned to many times in his work. And one of the versions of the way he said it starts like this. He said, "Now there is a reason I think Jesus says, 'Love your enemies.' It is this, that love has within it a redemptive power. There is a power there that eventually transforms individuals. Just keep being friendly to that person. Just keep loving them, and they can't stand it too long. Oh, they react in many ways in the beginning. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more at that transition period, but just keep loving them. By the power of your love, they will break down under the load." That's love, you see. There's something about love that builds up and is creative. There is something about hate that tears down and is destructive. So, love your enemies. Mary Beth McNulty is going to help light our chalice this morning, and I hope that you all will help by saying our chalice lighting words. We kindle this chalice flame to remind ourselves of the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment.
Good morning. Here we are in Ala Mikos, with the New Year's greeting moon in January at the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Burlington. The beautiful shores of Pitawabak, or the waters between, have been gray this week with a few precious minutes of sunshine and, of course, some snowflakes. We acknowledge the water and the land where the Abenaki foraged foods like butternut, berries, maple sugar, and greens. Today, you will still see the Abenaki connected to the land, committed to the cultural preservation and working for environmental justice in our communities. I want to respectfully acknowledge the Abenaki people who have cared for this land throughout the generations and recognize that we worship together on what was and is Abenaki land. My name is Mary Beth McNulty, and I want to welcome you all joining us in person and online this morning. I have some announcements, but if you bear with me, I promise you a dad joke at the end. Is there anyone here in the sanctuary today for the first or second time? Would you mind raising your hands? Welcome. Great to see you. If you haven't already, after the service, you can check in with today's welcome ambassadors, who I believe are Peggy Derber and Linda Vogler. Linda. Oh, great. They are waving in the back. You are also welcome to join us for coffee hour after the service in the community room downstairs. You can access the community room either via stairs, back there in the corner, or the elevator. Also, this afternoon, you can participate in a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. remembrance at 3 o'clock. It's a tradition of some years to host it here in the Meeting House, and this is the first time this event will be returning to the Meeting House in 3 years. A limited number of free tickets will be available in the office this morning, so you can just check with Mary after the service, and I saw it. There's a good handful of them still available. Today is also the second Sunday Circle, an opportunity to gather with others here or on Zoom to talk about today's sermon and readings as a small group. Gail Beck will facilitate, so grab your coffee and meet at 11:30 in the parlors. And finally, here's your dad joke. How do mountains stay warm in the winter? They put on their snow caps. Let us worship together.
In body or spirit as we sing together hymn number 118, This Little Light of Mine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Building up a world, I'm gonna let it shine. Building up a world, I'm gonna let it shine. Building up a world, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Thank you. Please be seated.
Could all of the children come forward now, as well as anyone else who would like a first row seat for the reflection for all ages? And as they're gathering, I'll introduce myself. I'm Erica Reif, the Director of Lifespan Faith Development. After this reflection that we all share together, the children and I and anyone else who would like to will be joining the Reverend David Ruffin, who's right here on the ground. He's going to lead us in a full group embodied exploration of singing and sounding our way toward collective liberation. Whoop. I strongly encourage older kids and youth to join us for this one. And if any adults feel like that's where you belong this morning, you are welcome to walk out with us right after this reflection. Have a few more kids coming up. Anybody else? So we have I'm going to use you have the handheld, okay. So we have a holiday coming up. Does anybody know what it is? Hazel? That's right, Martin Luther King Day.
So, why? Do you know? Why do we have a holiday for Martin Luther King Jr.? Why, Collins? Because he is absolutely a very important person. Yes. Why? Dax? Because he did very important things. That's really true. That's very true. What were some of those very important things? He made it be easier for people to be nice to brown people. Is that right? Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Vera. Yes. What? You get to answer too. Why do we have a holiday for Martin Luther King Jr.? You're going to have another chance if you don't have a quick and ready answer. But does anybody have a thought that you'd like to throw in now? Mark? He died for love. My goodness, what an idea. Yes. What else? Yes.
To honor his civil rights legacy.
To honor, the holiday is to honor the legacy of civil rights. Yes. Yes. Okay.
Can I actually borrow that mic from you and pass it back? Because these guys are all right here, and I don't want to
So, hello. Kind of back in here. Collins, do you have something important to say? He did some really good standing up for black people, yeah. So I was born in 1971, which was 3.5 years after Martin Luther King Jr. died. And as old as I might seem to you, I still really felt like this was something long ago and far away. It felt really distant to me. I think part of the reason that it seemed so distant was that a lot of like the video footage, the film, and the pictures were in black and white from that era. And, you know, as my childhood was starting, we were moving into color. And I want to hand you a picture. I'm going to show them some pictures, but it's nothing that you grown-ups haven't seen before. So here are some pictures from, this one's of Martin Luther King. Can you pass them around among the group of kids? And this is a protest march and speech. So part of it was the black and white, and then part of it is that growing up in the 70s in Maine, I never saw a group of people wearing suits and hats. In fact, I saw very few people ever wearing suits. So that also made it really feel old and distant when I would look at the pictures and the video footage, even though, like I said, it was just a few years before I was born. When I saw people at protest rallies and marches, they were wearing jeans and t-shirts. And there are a lot of hats in those pictures, right? Yeah. So partly it was all of those styles, but I think partly it was something else. I think it was a tempting, but mostly false idea that I belonged to a modern generation of people who had evolved so far past those backwards racist ideas that we would never act that way. And I think because I wanted to believe that tempting idea that was mostly false, it was easier to think of that as long ago and far away than to accept that it had just happened. And so I really believe that people in my time knew better, but the fact is that people knowing better wasn't at all what changed things. Beliefs weren't really what changed things because plenty of people, probably some that are in this room today, in the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s, plenty of people knew that Jim Crow and the system of racism that was happening at the time, they knew that it was wrong. They knew that absolutely. But that's not what changed it. Does anybody know what made changes in those laws? It wasn't until black people organized. It wasn't until black people with, the help of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., forced the system to change with their protests that actual change occurred. And so today we're going to play a little game of How Old Are You? To help us remember just how close this history is. And so grown-ups, you might have to admit how old you are.
Or not. Okay, what year was Martin Luther King born? I'm sorry, speak up. 22, 26, do I hear 1929? Because that's the right answer. So, I have a question for you kids. Do you think that there are people who were born in 1929 who are still alive today? Yes. Yes, that's true. There are people who are older than even people who were born before 1929. So, is there anybody in the sanctuary today who was born in 1929 or earlier? Okay, maybe not today because it's cold. Does anybody in this room know anybody who was born in 1929 or earlier? Oh my gosh, wow, okay. We do have some members who still come on Sundays sometimes and who definitely watch, hello, camera, who are older than Dr. King would be if he had lived. So, have any of you, first, you kids, have any of you heard about the bus boycott that happened in Montgomery, Alabama? Yeah? Yeah. What do you know about it? So Rosa Parks basically kind of sort of started it. What did Rosa Parks do? What did she refuse to do? What did she do? Okay. What did she do? Wait, we're going to ask Dax. Yeah. She refused to give her seat to a white person on the bus. Right. That's right. That's what it was. Right. And does anybody know when that happened? What year? Okay. The answer is 1955 is when the bus boycott happened. So if you were alive, any of you, not you guys probably, if any of you were alive in 1955, would you be willing to stand or raise your hand? Okay, kids, turn around and look and see. Me too. Thank you very much. Does anybody know how old, now if you're doing your arithmetic in your head, you could figure this out, but Dr. King was recruited to be the leader of the bus boycott movement, and he really helped to shape it. Do you know how old he was when that happened? 26. 26. Is there anybody here today who's around 26, in your 20s? Would you be willing to just stand up for a minute so we can see you? Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. You can sit down. So everybody who's older than that, do you remember what you were doing when you were 26? This might take a minute, but I want to invite you to, just for a minute, turn and share to a person next to you, especially if they're not a person that already knows you. What were you doing when you were 26? Thank you. Thank you. There's a lot to say, if you can remember, but when you were 26, I can sort of remember that. So, here we are. There's a bus boycott. The law in Montgomery at that point said that black people had to sit in certain seats in the bus, especially if a white person wanted their seat. So, did the city of Montgomery, Alabama, just decide that they were going to change the law? No. No. Actually, what happened was the black people, with some white supporters, but the black people of the city of Montgomery boycotted the buses. For how long? The boycott, I will need to let you know in case you don't, was supposed to last for a day. No, you can't answer, Peter. You already know the answer. It was supposed to last for a day or maybe 2 days, and then maybe they got excited and thought it could possibly last for a week. Do you know how long it lasted? It was a year. It was 381, I think is the number. A whole bunch of days that it lasted. Yes. And after that, the law changed.
So in 1960, there was a little girl named Ruby Bridges. Have you ever heard of her? Yeah? Well, she was 6 years old when she was the first black student to attend her elementary school. Margot, can you pass a picture of that out? Each day she had to be guarded by federal marshals so that she couldn't be hurt by white people that opposed the integration of the schools. Now, is there anybody here who's 6 years old? Could I get the 6-year-olds to stand up? Would you do that for us? We have one 6-year-old here today. There she is. Do we have any 7-year-olds? 7.5 does count. We got some 7-year-olds? Yeah. 5 is almost 6, right? So let's have everyone 5 to 7 years old. Can you stand up? Wow, that's great. Can you imagine? You look at the picture and think about that if that was your story. Ruby Bridges is still alive. Margot, can you pass that one out? That shows her as a kid, and it shows her now. Ruby Bridges is 68 years old, and she lives in Louisiana. So do we have anybody in this room who's 68? Or let's say 67 through 69. Can anybody out there who's 67 through 69 stand up? Kids, can you look back and see how many people are the same age as that little girl in the picture? It includes Reverend Tricia, too. All of you that are 67 through 69, do you remember your first day of first grade? Yeah.
I think on my first day of first grade, I was mostly concerned that I would know what time we should eat lunch. I have some dim fear about that. Okay, so that was in 1960. 3 years later, in 1963, an event that became known as the Children's Crusade took place in Birmingham, Alabama. Have you heard about the Children's Crusade, you guys? Okay, I'm going to tell you something you don't know. Children, some of them as young as 7. Who are our 7-year-olds? 7.5. Okay, good. That's great. A lot of teenagers. All the teenagers, I think, are upstairs. We have any okay. And children, thousands and thousands of children left school on a particular day, and then some other days after it. They filled the streets protesting, and they knew this was going to happen. They let themselves be arrested as marchers, illegally marching. And where do people who are arrested get sent? Yeah? To jail. So they filled the jails. And the kids knew this was going to happen, and they asked to be allowed to do this. And Dr. King said, yes. What, Collins? It doesn't make sense. Collins says it does not make sense, and I agree with you. And the kids were smart enough to realize it didn't make sense to put children in jail. But what these kids, they had been seeing, this was 1963, so protests and marches had been going on for a number of years, and they said they hadn't quite worked yet. Alabama hadn't changed its laws. Birmingham was not a safe place to be, so they said, let us do it. It will be on the news, it will be in the newspaper, and there'll be tons of us. And because there are tons of us, nothing really terrible will happen. I want to believe that they believed that, and in fact, that was true. And so it became known as the Children's Crusade. Do you think it made any difference? Do you think it made any difference, Em? I think it did make a difference. I think it did. It did make a difference. So, I'm glad, Francis, that you think it made a difference, too. How about all of you? Do you think it made a difference? Yes, it did. So, for, let's see here. If you are, we're going to make you do this again, between the ages of 7, because the youngest children were 7, and 18, if there's anybody here, can you just stand up and stay standing up for a minute? 7.5 totally works. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So those children who were between the ages of, thank you, of 7 and 18 are now, yes, stay standing up. And the people who were those ages then are between the ages of 67 and 78 now. Could everybody who's between the, no, you stay up. Everybody who's between the ages of 67 and 78, would you stand up too? Thank you. So turn around, do what you're doing already, look at each other. Those of you who are not standing, meaning that you're in between these two sets of ages, try to imagine if this were your story. The city of Birmingham did not decide to desegregate just because it was the right thing to do. Even if they knew it was the right thing to do, they decided to change the laws because people were organizing and showing up and saying it needed to happen. Yes. Thank you.
Kids, I hope seeing everyone stand today helps you to remember that this piece of our history was not that long ago, not that far away. And maybe you have someone in your own family who was alive back then who you could ask to tell you more about what it was like.
So the children are thinking about whether there's somebody in their family that they can ask about this, what happened, what their experience was. So my question is, adults in the room, is there a young person, a child or a young adult in your life with whom you've never had this conversation up till now? Or maybe you have, and maybe it was a long time ago, or maybe you just want to do it again. I want to invite you to think of who that young person might be and take just a minute to promise yourself that you're going to do that. Good. Good. I think it is time for the children and David Ruffin and teachers to head downstairs. Thanks. So take a breath. Maybe two. As we let these ideas and imaginations and good questions settle into us, I would invite you all to notice what that brings up for you. Thinking about your own life. Thinking what on earth that sound is. It's a mystery. It will be solved. Worship together every week with questions. Sometimes we don't know what the questions are, and they pop up in the midst of our time together. It's good to let them pop up and live with them for a moment or two. We always, I think, come to worship together with some joys. I hope always with some joys in our lives that maybe want to pop up and be noticed. And some sorrows too. It's good to give all of it some space inside you and some space in this community. I have two concerns particular to this day, January 15th, 2023. The first from Sue, who wrote, "My brother Les died, and I'm really missing him a lot. As long as I'm alive, I will always miss him. I will always remember him. I will always love him. Thank you for caring." For all of us who are missing someone who has recently left this life, let us open our hearts to remember what that is like, to notice our fears, to remember to reach out. And let us pause for a moment as we sit here in this lovely state we call Vermont, where a kind of a chilly Sunday morning is almost the hardest thing we've had to deal with in winter so far. Our friends, our family, those we don't know are dealing with the effects of this thing that only recently we've come to know as an atmospheric river flooding the state of California again and again and again. And the tornadoes in Georgia and especially Alabama. I don't know whether you heard that the city of Selma, which is a small city, not a wealthy municipality, was really hit hard by tornadoes this week. Selma always hosts a reenactment of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in every year and to mark Dr. King's birthday. And that celebration is going ahead. And there are ways that all of us can reach out online to help the people of Selma. So with these concerns and sorrows and hopes and wishes in our minds and hearts, let us be silent for just a moment together. And then if you are moved to come forward to choose a stone and place it, and as we make a little sculpture together, you're welcome to do that too. But first, some silence. May the joys and sorrows of each of us be held by this community and become the joys and the sorrows of all of us. We take a moment in our worship together every week to remember that this congregation exists because people believe in it and think it matters. It matters. Maybe Collins would say it just doesn't make sense if this congregation weren't here. So it's important to remember that every week. And it's important to get together to offer our financial support in any way that we can, and also to remember that we're giving money away to organizations in the community that are doing the work that our values tell us is essential. For this month of January, we are sharing our offering with the Housing Retention Service, which is a statewide program that addresses housing instability and provides one-on-one support, including interpretation and translation with materials and workshops, because they work especially with those who are newly arrived in this country, refugees and asylees. It's part of the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, which is committed to expanding access to housing, fighting discrimination, and making communities more inclusive and welcoming to all. Because you're here today, because you're watching online today, you have an opportunity to support this program that I think all of us have some imagination of how important it is. Your offerings in person, if you want to come up and put something in the basket, online if you want to text a gift or write a check later, it's all good. Let us speak the words of offering dedication. With gratitude, we dedicate our gifts in the service of our mission to inspire spiritual growth, care for each other and our community, seek truth, and act for justice.
I'm waiting for the slide. Woody, is there a slide? Maybe. Maybe. It's there? Oh, it went away. Okay. Y'all, I grew up in Virginia, and I grew up in that sort of middle period that we heard about in that reflection for all ages. And so my favorite pronoun is y'all, because it's delightfully gender neutral. It feels like home, sounds like home to me. But not everything that I grew up with fits as nicely into my adult life as the perfect gender neutral pronoun. In particular, as we're looking ahead or reflecting this weekend on Dr. King's legacy, I grew up with this next slide. This was my holiday. Yeah, so when I was about this age, as like kids we got to enjoy this morning, my school got out for Lee Jackson King Day, and if you're not real sure on who Lee and Jackson are, those are Confederate generals. So Virginia history gets a little tangled. And when I was a kid, race and justice work and Dr. King's legacy got pretty tangled with this heavy Confederate history, as Virginia is the capital of the Confederacy. You may remember, right on that Mason-Dixon line. And so I had a good lesson in irony, but not necessarily a good lesson in race and Dr. King and justice work. And so this morning I thought we'd practice a little something I do in my classroom with my students called a turn and talk, because the way that I got better, the way that I learned was through a lot of conversations with a lot of people from other places and other races. And so the next slide is just going to introduce you to a turn and talk. As I said, it's the strategy. And the idea is that there's not a person up in the front of the room who's talking to you and telling you everything you need to know, because in my experience, that person might not tell you everything you need to know. It's really about turning to your neighbor and having a conversation. So we're going to put up 2 slides related to Dr. King's legacy. There's a picture, there's a quote, and I'd love it if you could turn, Reverend Tricia warmed you up for this nicely, to turn and talk to a neighbor maybe about what your experiences were with Dr. King's legacy, or your experience or your thoughts related to the quote or the picture. Here's your first one. And if you, like my husband, are opposed to group work, and he was very clear that a turn and talk was group work, you are welcome to have a quiet reflection. So our first slide for turn and talk is this one from Dr. King. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. So have a conversation with your neighbor. We're going to take a look at one more slide. So here we have Coretta Scott King, and she says, all of the world's great problems, the struggles for self-determination and human rights, stopping war, halting the arms race, checking the exploitation of multinational corporations, and confronting the global environmental crisis, must be addressed by nonviolent movements. Let's have one more turn and talk, slightly different focus here. I hate to stop you from your rich conversations, but I have one more slide for you. This one we won't turn and talk about. I'll just tell you a little bit about it. This is a picture that my trans niece, actually, who lives in Richmond, Virginia, sent me in June of 2020. And you probably didn't, I hope, you didn't grow up with statues of Confederate war soldiers and generals. This is a statue of Robert E. Lee in this beautiful street in Richmond, Virginia called Monument Avenue. And when I was growing up, all of these statues were pristine as part of celebrating Lee Jackson King Day. It was all part and parcel of Virginia history for us. And here, my niece sends me this photo in June of, I don't know if you can really see all the graffiti on it, and then this big sign of tear it down. And I just love that this difference from when I was a kid growing up in Virginia to what my niece experienced. It's time to take them down. And so it took a year after she sent me this photo of the graffiti and the movement that it took to pull it down, this statue of Robert E. Lee. And since then, the last statue went down just in December. So the movement of young people and people of color and Virginians working together to pull down these statues finally meant some real progress. And so I just want to leave you with that thought of these conversations matter, and the work we do together matters. Things aren't perfect in Virginia, nor are they perfect anywhere. We still have work to do, but I hope that we can continue to dialogue and be part of these movements together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Beth. So you've probably figured out already that our goal today is to get you to think about how you remember Martin Luther King, how you remember the movement either personally or what you've heard about it, what your questions are, but how it has affected you. Some of us were alive when the people of Montgomery, Alabama walked instead of riding the buses for those 381 days. It wasn't easy. I don't know how much you've read about that whole thing. Some people could walk to work. Some people really couldn't walk that far. So the citizens, the black citizens, worked out a system of taxis in which they would give rides to, black drivers would give rides to black customers. And the city of Montgomery passed a new law that required, all kinds of things. One which was a minimum fare of 45 cents, which was actually more money than some people could afford. So there were, every time there was a success, there was an effort, successful to some extent, to stop it, and yet they continued. Some of you, some of us, were there in an audience when Pete Seeger taught us to sing, or how to sing, "We Shall Overcome." How many of you were ever in that? Oh, I'm sorry it wasn't more. Put your hands up. Put your hands up. And many of us remember the March of 1963 in Washington, or think we remember because we've seen the grainy film so often. It was, you might remember, 100 years after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. That was not a coincidence, that was on purpose. And people came to Washington from far and wide to march together, to sing and to listen and to weep and to shout, "Now is the time." I'm wondering if you have a memory of what it was like to read the newspaper, if you're as old as I am, to watch the news in those days. Martin Luther King's wonderful cadences and crescendos. I've never used my voice in the way that he did. He took 8 preaching classes while he was in seminary and getting his doctorate. And you might think, why on earth did Martin Luther King have to take 8 preaching classes? But it might have been partially to just get the gift that he already had, to be the sparkling gift that he's left with all of us. We remember, perhaps, President Johnson with his long, sad face, speaking partly in Washington speak and partly in words that have echoed through history. So many voices. Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, George Wallace, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I remember the newspapers. I remember watching the news. I have pictures in my head of so many people's faces, so serious. It's a little hard, even at this distance, to imagine any of them laughing with their children or relaxing or just being happy. And for me, all of those memories get mixed up with President Kennedy's death and J. Edgar Hoover and Bobby Kennedy, his campaign and his assassination, and of course, Dr. King's assassination, and the gathering sense that Vietnam was a place that we absolutely should not be fighting a war. It was such an uncertain time. I've tried, but I can't remember thinking that anybody really knew how it would turn out. No one in the government, not my teachers, not my parents. And though my friends and I made big, angry pronouncements to make it sound as if we did know what should happen and what would happen, we didn't know either. All of us were swept along in those days in a fast-moving sequence of events, none of it completely rational, none of it predictable, all of it frightening, some of it exhilarating. Everything mattered, and nothing was quite in control. To me, even as a child, like these children we had this morning, the idea that black people and white people should live separately, should be unequal, should not be able to share the same lunch counter, that idea made no sense to me ever in my life that I can remember. It may have been normal, but it was just plain wrong. I knew that. I must have my parents to thank for that wisdom, though I cannot remember talking about it much with them at all. What I do know is that my parents were frightened of Martin Luther King. Not perhaps of what he said exactly, but because of the change that he represented. My parents, like so many in their generation, had put everything into building a safe, happy life after living through the horrors of World War II. The threat of communism was bad enough. To have black people in the streets demanding their rights must have seemed too much, too fast. Why couldn't things just stay the same? If a lot of good white people like my parents didn't quite understand why things needed to change, for Martin King and for many other African Americans, one can imagine all, especially those who had lived for a time, any time outside the American South, the need for change could not have been more clear. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta in 1929 at the outset of the Great Depression. Much has been made of his middle-class upbringing, his education at Morehouse College, at Crozier Seminary, and Boston University, but no one in his family had forgotten the poverty and economic exploitation that had so recently been their family's reality. The church that supported Martin's family had been built from almost nothing by his parents and his grandparents before them. At least 3 of Martin's great-grandparents were enslaved, and one of his grandfathers celebrated his birthday. He changed his birthday to January 2nd, 1863, which was the day after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. And after the Civil War, after emancipation, all of King's ancestors worked on land owned by whites. They were sharecroppers, which meant spending the entirety of their lives in debt with no certainty. Not any certainty of enough to eat or clothes to wear, or much less any freedom to start a business or to help shape society, except, and this is a big except through the church. Martin's father was a successful and respected minister, not at the beginning, but he developed his church so that he was an important man. His church preached the black Christian social gospel message that all of God's children have equal rights. He was known as Daddy King. Since he had escaped from the world of plantations, he arriving in Atlanta with 1913 with nothing, he knew firsthand about the work to be done before that goal could be a reality, and so he taught his son. It all happened in such a short time. 14 years between Martin Luther King's graduation from seminary in 1954 to his murder in 1968. 14 years of speeches and marches, late-night meetings, interviews with jail cells and death threats, numerous in between, starting in Montgomery with the bus boycott, moving to Birmingham, all over the South, Washington, D.C., winning the Nobel Peace Prize, working in Chicago, and then in Memphis. 14 years to be married, to father 4 children, to struggle with his own fears and weaknesses. It is completely unreasonable to imagine that he was in any way prepared for the role that he took on, except perhaps through his faith. And that role changed him along the way. In 1965, so 3 years before he died, at the end of the 55-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, and 10 years after the bus boycott that had started it all, Dr. King said, "We must come to see that the society we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience." His campaign was no longer just about racism and segregation. By the late 60s, his focus had moved beyond desegregation to denouncing the tyrannies of militarism and capitalism that keep so many people of whatever color poor and out of power, and that keep all of us out of peace. By the last year of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. had put justice for poor and working class people at the center of his agenda. He launched the Poor People's Campaign, demanding that Congress shift spending from war to housing, to healthcare, to education and jobs. He sought an economic Bill of Rights for Native Americans, for Mexican Americans, for Puerto Ricans, for poorer whites, as well as for blacks. Michael K. Honey, a white man who's a professor of history and a student of Martin Luther King, wrote this about that last year. He sought to create a nonviolent army of poor people in jobless inner cities and barrios and in reservations and rural areas. He traveled the country in a whirlwind, scarcely sleeping, preaching the gospel of economic justice. And then he was killed. His plans came to an end. His voice was silenced, and his impact began to grow larger than ever. I believe that the most significant gift that Dr. King has left us, most useful to me anyway, are his sermons and speeches. And because he made so many of them and they were recorded, and because the King Foundation has assembled them, and Beacon Press, you know that Beacon Press has an exclusive right to republish King's books. Did you know that? Beacon Press, Unitarian Universalist Association, way to go. Throughout his life, the public adult part of his life, he was a preacher. And there is evidence, I looked this up, that he was preaching about loving one's enemies as early as 1952. He delivered a sermon on that topic to the Dexter Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, his first church, in 1957, the year the boycott ended. He's preaching from the Gospel of Matthew. So this is Jesus talking. I'll just read a little bit of it to you again. He said, "Love has within it a redemptive power, a power that eventually transforms individuals. Just keep being friendly. Just keep loving them. Sometimes they'll hate you a little more, but just keep loving them. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load." I love that idea. That's love, you see. He wrote, "There's something about love that builds up and is creative. There is something about hate that tears down and is destructive. So love your enemies." King rejected the idea that Jesus' teaching was the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer. He called this teaching a command, an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. Love, he said, is the key to the solution of the world's problems. Yes, even love for enemies. The fact that so much of what Dr. King worked for has not yet come to pass does not let us off the hook. This place we're in today, this moment of our country's history, in the world's history, we have seen it before. We have seen it before, and we have taken hold of our despair and our fear before. We have found inspiration and joy and hoped for dreams before, and we can again. If Martin Luther King were alive at 94 today, There's no question that he would still be talking about freedom and dignity and the right to work and the right to vote, and that he would remind us that the only thing worse than the violent hatred of some is the silence of others who see what's wrong and do nothing about it. And he would tell us to love our enemies, not only because it has the power to transform them, but because it has the power to transform us. I want to finish with one of my favorite quotes from James Baldwin, who wrote, "For the sake of one's children, one must be careful not to take refuge in any delusion, and the value placed on the color of the skin is always and everywhere and forever a delusion. I know what I am asking is impossible," he wrote. But in our time, as in every time, the impossible is the least that one can demand. And one is, after all, emboldened by the spectacle of human history in general and American Negro history in particular, Baldwin says, for it testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands, he wrote. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. James Baldwin, preaching. Okay, now I have to tell you a story, and then we'll sing again. You've heard this before, maybe, from me or other people, but I love it. In 1932, union organizer Miles Horton and his wife Zilphia and a few of their friends started a place called Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. They wanted to use education to create a new social order. So in the 1930s and 40s, they organized workers to demand their rights. In the late 40s and 50s, they fought segregation in unions, and they began to teach black people to demand, nonviolently, that segregation laws be changed. Rosa Parks was there in 1955, just before the bus thing happened. In 1946, a new song was brought to Highlander because Zilphia invited these union workers to bring their songs. And some women who had been strikers from the Food and Tobacco Workers Union introduced a song that they'd recently been singing, titled "I'll Be All Right." It was a strike song adapted from a spiritual. And Zilphia especially liked one verse, which repeated the line, "I'll overcome." You see where this is going. She and the union leaders rewrote the song to give it a more collective community spirit, and the song they came up with was called "We Will Overcome." 1 year later, in 1947, a year that some people I know and love were born, Pete Seeger was visiting Highlander, and he learned the song there, 1947. He changed "will" to "shall" and changed the harmonies a bit and added some verses of his own, and in 1957, when Highlander was celebrating its 25th anniversary, and the keynote speaker there was Martin Luther King Jr. He was 27. Pete Seeger was there too, and he led the assembly in a rousing chorus of "We Shall Overcome." As they drove away from Highlander, the story is Dr. He didn't learn the song there, but he heard it, and he heard it sung in a particular way, and he said, "That song really stays with you, doesn't it?" Let us sing.
Let's stand and sing together in body or spirit. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we'll walk hand in hand someday. We will all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall all be free someday. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall live in peace someday.
Please be seated. Let's extinguish our chalice, these words together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and share with the world until we are together again. Let us go forth into the world through a door of hope for the future, remembering these words by Dr. King. Even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. So may it be with us.
One man come in the name of love. One man come and go. One man come he to justify. One man to overthrow. In the name of love. Once more in the name of love. In the name of love. Once more in the name of love. One man crawled on a barbed wire fence. One man he resists. One man washed on an empty beach. One man betrayed with a kiss. In the name of love. Once more in the name of love. In the name of love. Once more in the name of love. Whoa, 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 whoa. Early morning, April 4th, a shot rang out from the Memphis sky. Free at last, they took your life, but they couldn't take your pride. In the name of love, once more in the name of love. In the name of love. Go in peace.